Happy Easter, everyone. Northway is a multi-site church, so let me welcome you whether you're worshiping with us today in Oakland or Sewickley Valley, East End, Dormont, or Wexford. We are thrilled that you are here. You may not know this, but this is the 35th Easter weekend that Northway has celebrated together as a church. And if you've been here for all 35 of them, welcome. And if this is your very first one, welcome. Again, we are just really thrilled that you are here today. We launch a 4-part series today titled You Make Me Brave. That it's going to look at 4 fears that I think all of us will encounter at some point throughout our lives. Next week, we're going to talk about the fear of loneliness or being alone. And this could look like a young adult that's looking for a spouse, or it could be a widow that's fearful of spending her senior years without companionship. In week 3 of this series, let me just ask you a question. Have you ever been afraid, even just a little bit, of what others might think of you or what they might be saying about you? The fear of man is where we'll land in week 3. And then in week 4, we're going to talk about a fear that I don't think we talk about enough. And I think sometimes, particularly as Christians maybe, specifically, we don't talk about this fear. And it's the fear that God's not going to come through. Like, we know He can, and we know He has the power, and we've seen Him do it in other people's lives, but sometimes we just have this fear that somehow He's not going to come through or show up for us. Today, the first week of this series, I want to talk about another fear, and that's the fear of death. Happy Easter. Aren't you glad you came? We're going to talk about dying, right? So, actually, though, I don't think there is a better weekend to talk about it, because that's what this weekend is really all about. Jesus' death on a cross, known as Good Friday, is the validation of why He came. And it's followed by the victory over death with an empty tomb that we celebrate on Easter. See what I just said, folks? Jesus' validation and victory that we celebrate. This should be a very big deal. See, I think, however, for many of us, if we're really honest with ourselves, maybe it's not. And it's just like, yeah, I get it, Scott. See, what I've learned from working with people for many years, it's sort of simple. If this day is not a very big deal, if you don't know Jesus, it's because you don't know who Jesus is. Now, I know, like, that's real profound, Scott, right? But track with me on this. See, some have walked away from Jesus because Christianity or because religion has painted an unappealing picture of Him. And for that, if that's happened to you, I am truly sorry. Religion and church is not Jesus. Again, if you don't know Jesus, it's because you don't know who Jesus is, because this is who Jesus is. Jesus is gracious. Jesus is forgiving. Jesus is full of hope, and He's faithful to His followers. Jesus is love. He's patient and kind. Jesus, He does not envy. He does not boast. He is not proud, is not rude. He is not self-seeking. Jesus is not easily angered. He keeps no record of wrongs, and He never fails. And if you're here today, then I believe at some level, right, you long for that Jesus. Because that's who Jesus is, and anything else is a sham or a shadow. He died innocently on a cross and was buried in a tomb. And Easter is not the end of His story. It's the beginning of the story that He wants to write in your life, that He wants to share with you. I want to share with you one of my favorite stories about Jesus. The story is recorded in the Bible by a man named Mark. Mark was a close friend, scholars believe, of the disciple Peter. Most of you probably have heard of the disciple Peter. And most scholars believe that Peter, what he did is he relayed eyewitness accounts of his time traveling side by side with Jesus to Mark. And then Mark recorded them in a book in the Bible called Mark. In this particular eyewitness account that Peter relayed to Mark, it's really early in Jesus' ministry. And we're going to see that his teachings and his miracles and his healings are drawing these massive crowds wherever he goes. God-fearing Jews and non-believing Gentiles are showing up. You know, the rich as well as the poor from the area are being drawn everywhere he goes. And as you're going to see, this story, it revolves around the fear of death. In fact, it is probably literally a father's worst nightmare. In Mark 5, verse 21, it says this, and when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeking him, he fell at his feet. So this man falls at Jesus' feet and implored him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live." And Jesus, he went with him. Now, a couple things happen here that I want to make sure that you catch a glimpse of. One, this man is a very prominent, wealthy man in the community. He is most likely exhausted all his other options for his daughter. So much so that he doesn't even mind risking embarrassment by falling at the feet of Jesus and begging him to come. And we also know the next sort of 8 or 9 verses, as Jesus is traveling to this man's house, another woman approaches him. And she has a disease, and Jesus heals her right on the spot. And then the story picks up. It says, while he was still speaking, so basically to that woman that he had just healed, there came from the ruler's house some who said, "Your daughter is dead." Man, just put yourself in that dad's spot. So some men meet them on their way back. Hey, you don't have to bother the teacher any longer because your father is dead. But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." Do not fear, only believe. You know, I just recently returned from a mission trip to India. And that scripture actually came up in a late night conversation one night that I was having with Emmanuel Pothin. Northway has been resourcing the Pothin's ministry in India for over 30 years. And while I was there, we did some pastor sort of training seminars. We visited many of the church plants. We went to their children's homes that they lead. They're very similar to orphanages. And we spoke at their Bible school graduation. And I got to tell you, man, I loved everything about their ministry. I loved everything about India, about the country. Man, I loved the people. I loved the food. I loved the culture. India is an amazing country, and I would go back there in a heartbeat. I loved everything except for one thing. They're driving. Oh, goodness gracious. They're driving. You know, Pastor Thomas, I have a picture of him here. He was one of our drivers for several days, and before I went out with him the first day, I noticed that his side mirrors on his van were folded in. And I said, why do you do that? He says, well, when we get out there in traffic, I need the extra space. I soon realized as we were traveling at top speed down highways that he did need those extra few inches many times. You might find yourself in India, folks, on a 6-lane road. I mean, 3 going with you and 3 coming at you. And it doesn't matter. All lanes are available in India. Those lanes could be occupied by 15 motorcycles, 3 rickshaws, a bus, your van, and cows. And that's it. You're just vying for your spot. Let me give you a little advice. If you had a friend that grew up in India, don't lend him your car. Like, I'm just telling you don't do that. Over the past 30 years, the Pothins have graduated hundreds of young men and women from their Bible school. And get this, resulting in nearly 600 churches being planted. And one afternoon, Doug Melder and I, we sat with 3 of this year's graduates while we were in India to hear their story There's a picture of these three young guys. And one of the graduates, a young man, he's the one standing actually next to Doug, told us that as a young boy, he was sold by his desperately poor family to a band of terrorists for $8 a month. And he was involved in raids against the local government. And a few years into this, as a teenager, he found himself near death suffering from malaria, and he was sent home basically either to get well or to die. And while he was home, a Christian pastor visited their village and prayed for him and shared the gospel, and he was healed and he became a believer. And he left secretly with that pastor, basically adopted him, and then from there he ended up in the Bible school. Get this. He plans to return to his hometown and plant a church, the same hometown that terrorist group is still active and seeking to find him. Why? He told us because he loves his home village, and he knows the culture there, and he knows the strongholds of that area. So despite the danger, he wants to do ministry and plant a church there. That's amazing. You know, during this late night conversation that I had with Emmanuel Pothen, we talked about the Hindu religion, specifically about sharing the story of Jesus with Hindus in India. And I just want to say this, I'm very ignorant when it comes to the specifics of the Hindu religion, so what I'm relaying to you here is what I jotted down as I spoke to Emmanuel that night and his mom, Molly Pothen. It's what they shared with me. Hindu is an ancient religion where a believer prays to and worships many gods and idols. And often when you tell them about Jesus, Emmanuel told us that very often they're eager to absorb Jesus into their belief structure. Basically to place Jesus right up on the shelf with all of their other gods. They love the stories of Jesus. They wouldn't want to do anything to offend him. And as a Christian, I believe at times we can really learn from people from other religions, from the Hindus that I encountered. I saw a real devotion and reverence to the divine. And it made me reflect on sometimes how casual I can be about my faith, about Jesus. And in India, they explained to us that there's these crossroad moments for many Christians that are from a Hindu background. See, as they learn more about Jesus, they have to make a decision whether Jesus is going to be their God or one of their gods. And these crossroads moments, they could look like several things. One, it could be when they're told they literally need to rid their house of all the other idols and gods, literally clean them off the shelves and off the doorways. Secondly is when they're told they need to stop going to Hindu temples of worship. And third, as they learn about Jesus, they come to this understanding that he's the living God. And the weight of truly believing in Jesus comes with a paradigm shift about the afterlife. Christians do not believe in reincarnation. We believe in the resurrection. And see, it's at one of these three crossroads moments that Emmanuel says, tragically, many decide to leave Jesus on the shelf with all their other gods and truly not follow him. See, while I was in India, something struck me. And it hit me with a whole lot of sadness in that late night conversation. Because, see, I believe Americans often do the same thing. Jesus is on the shelf with all the other priorities and focuses and desires. Jesus is on the shelf with all of our other gods. We don't want to do anything to offend Jesus, but he's not central. We worship our gods of education or physical beauty or financial success. We've set, our possessions or our kids or our pursuit of happiness slightly above or right beside Jesus. We place our love of country or our passion for justice issues in a more prominent place on that shelf than our love and our passion for Jesus. And when we do this, we're essentially doing what I call that we're a functional theist. And hear me on this. This is not a theological or a biblical term. It's just a name that I've given to what I just described. I believe that functional theism is when what you claim to believe about God is in contrast to your actions. I believe it's believing in Jesus, but going about orchestrating all of the aspects of your life without even consulting him. I believe it is saying that you believe in God, but yet really only going to him when what you want is not going as you wanted it to go. I would almost compare this like to being, the term like a functional alcoholic. Many functional alcoholics, they can manage life, even excel and succeed, but it's all a charade because they're numb to the real experiences and real living. Alcoholism will eventually rob them of relationships and of joy and of meaning, and everything will come up lacking and empty. And I believe it's the same with functional theism. Life is going to come up empty and lacking, and relationships and joy and meaning will not be full or as full and as powerful. They'll be numb and flat and cold. In talking with Emmanuel that night, it struck me that when he said that almost every one of their graduates from their Bible school returns to their hometown to plant a church because they know the culture and the needs and the strongholds of that town, but also because they have a deep love for their people there, that they are passionate about their own coming to know Jesus. I was born and raised in Pittsburgh and plan on serving my entire life, devoting my ministry efforts to this town. I love everything about this town. I believe in this town. I believe in its people. I believe in its sports teams. I love the food and the culture. But here is also what I believe. I believe the number one stronghold in this region is functional theism. Over the years, I have had countless conversations with people from this region about serious things of faith and about salvation and about belief in Christ. And so often, this conversation ends with them saying something like this to me: Scott, God and I, we're good. I might not be a religious nut, and I'm not, maybe all into church, but I'm trying to lead a good life, better than most. Man, Scott, in the end, I know it's God and I, we're good. See, some people that are not afraid of death should be, because I believe in this region, Satan has deceived many of us into believing that God and I, we're good. But yet, in reality, Jesus is up there on the shelf with all the other gods. And to be blunt, at its core, functional theism is a sin. You and I were created with a purpose, and we were created to enjoy God and glorify God with our lives. But we don't. So often instead, he just goes up on a shelf with all the other gods. Why? Because of this one little word, sin. And what is sin? I think so often we think of sin, we think of things like murder and abuse and stealing and violence, and those are the extremes of it. But sin is simply lawlessness against the holy God. And functional theism, it's a sin. It's doing what we want and paying lip service to God. Instead of placing God in the proper place in our lives, we just keep pursuing a life of purposelessness. And that's spiritual death. It shows up sometimes in our lives in two forms, and you might be able to identify with one of these. One, it's just that it shows up when you just try this, and you long for that, and you just keep going to wells that are empty. You keep trying to achieve and earn more or succeed more, all the while you're just running on this treadmill and not going anywhere because there's a spiritual death. And I think secondly, it shows up sometimes where we just decide to punt. We'll just say forget it. This is too much. If you're in that group, maybe you've had a conversation with your heart and you've just sadly given up and saying, it doesn't matter. And maybe I don't either. The brutal reality is sin does not just lead to purposelessness, which is spiritual death. It leads to physical death. And again, in this region, I believe many people have been deceived into believing that God and them, that they're good. And I know we don't like to talk about this much. And I know that it's not politically correct. But God does have an answer. And God says that He stored up and set apart a place where He will forever punish sin. A place called hell. A real place where God will forever, eternally, rightfully, and justly punish sin. And we don't talk about that enough. And a lot of people have tried to explain it out of existence, but frankly, I don't think we take it nearly as seriously as we ought to. Until we honestly examine the weight of spiritual death, until we really examine sin, until sin becomes very bitter, Jesus is never going to become sweet. Ephesians 2:1 says this, "And you were dead in the trespasses and sins in which you once walked, following the course of this world, following the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that is now at work in the sons of disobedience, among whom we all once lived in the passions of our flesh, carrying out the desires of the body and the mind." And here it is, folks, this is us. We were by nature children of wrath, like the rest of mankind. The Apostle Paul, what he's describing right there is spiritual and physical death. He's describing sin, and we fight so hard against removing those gods and idols from our house because of sin. And he is making it really clear here that sin isn't what you do, sin is who we are. And we are talking about right here about eternal punishment and death. And we need to feel that sting, that despair, that weight, that seriousness of this. Because see, you can't earn your way out of that. And I'm just telling you, God and I are good is not going to cut it. If you're really honest, some of you are exhausted. You're exhausted from pursuing so many other gods. And others of you, you've just became so fatigued, you just gave up. And if that describes you, these next two words of this scripture are for you. Please hear them. Verse 4 goes on to say, but God, being rich in mercy, because of the great love with which He loved us, even when we were dead in our trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved. That is Easter. Christ died for our sins on Friday. And He said, it is finished. He validated who He is. He's not just another God on a shelf. On Sunday, He rose from the dead, victorious over death. And if you say you believe in that God, yet you live as if you don't, you are a slave to sin. And you've been deceived. I decided a while back, months ago, that this Easter, I wanted to be more direct. Because I just don't want anybody walking out of here and saying, God and I, we're good. I really want you to wrestle with it. And I decided that months ago, and then a few weeks ago, I visited a country where there are 1 billion people that don't know Jesus. And I decided that in this service, I want to give us all just a moment to think about this. I'm going to invite the bands back up at all of our campuses, wherever you're worshiping. The bands can make their way up to the stage. And, I don't know, I'm doing this because this is a 4-minute song. And when's the last time you just spent 4 minutes thinking about where you are with God? And my hope is that somewhere in this song that you will be confronted with the reality of what it is that you believe. Maybe for you it's just reflect on these words. But maybe for some of you, in this moment, that you can hear from God in a way that you haven't in a long, long time. So of all of our campuses, we're just going to let this song wash over you. The line said, "So I could stand and sing, I am a child of God." I believe this region is scattered with folks that need to evaluate whether they are truly standing for Christ. Standing is an action. It's an act of the will. Standing up and saying, "I am a child of God," is very different than saying, "God and I are good." Back to this story that we started with from the Gospel of Mark. If you recall, they just received this bad news that their daughter's dead. And it continues on. It says, "And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. That they came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion. People were weeping and wailing loudly. And when he had entered, he said to them, 'Why are you making commotion and weeping? This child is not dead, but sleeping.' And they laughed at him. But he put them all outside, and he took the child's father and the mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. And taking her by the hand, he said to her, 'Talitha kumi,' which means, 'Little girl, I say to you, arise.' And immediately she got up and began walking around, and they were immediately overcome with amazement. Jesus said to this little girl, 'You're not dead. You're just sleeping. Stand up, child of God.'" When it comes to your faith, some of you are here today, you're sleeping. And you need to hear this. Arise. Stand up. When it comes to your faith, some of you are functional theists in this room. And you just need to hear this word, that Aramaic word, kumi, means arise. I say to you, get up. Clear your home of the false gods and idols. Arise. Jesus did not die on the cross for those that do not believe. He died on a cross for those that hear and believe. Arise. On Easter morning, people came to that tomb expecting to find a dead body. And instead, an angel greeted them and said, "He is not here. He is risen, just as he said he would." That is a powerful God, not a God to say, "God, now we're good." No. That is a God to follow, to make central in your life, to not casually treat him like any other important thing or priority in your life. And it would be an injustice today if I don't give you an opportunity to respond to that. So at all of our campuses, will you stand up with me right now? Your campus leader on your campus, if he could sort of make his way to the front. And all I'm going to do is in a moment, I'm just going to lead you in a prayer. And if you walked in here as a functional theist, why don't you walk out of here a child of God? And it's just a simple yielding of your heart, putting God in his proper place, in a central place in your life. So can we all bow our heads across all campuses, no one looking around? It's just a simple prayer that goes something like, "God, today, I no longer want to use this statement that you and I are good. Today, I want to be identified as a child of God. God, I want to give you your rightful spot. Forgive me for my sin. God, rush into my life and change me deeply in this moment, right here." And with no one looking around, we've always had a tradition at Northway where we just feel like we don't want this moment to pass without you marking it. So if you said that prayer with all heads bowed, no one looking around, all I want you to do, wherever you're worshiping, is just slip up your hand and look at me, and I'll agree with you simply.